Join us from all over the globe today. We had some people last week who joined us from Israel and from Guyana and from Kenya and all over Brazil. Let's see, all across the U.S., everything from up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, across to Washington and down to California, some folks in Illinois and some folks in Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey, our good friends down in Miami, Florida, and some other spots in Florida, some folks from Georgia last week, our good friends down in Texas, El Paso, and some other spots, and even a couple spots I've probably forgotten all around the DMZ. We're glad you've joined us today as we kind of try to experience some community in the midst of this separation time. But I want to ask you a question as we begin today. Have you ever had this wonderful idea that you just thought was, this was the best idea ever, and it was so good, and then you shared it, and once you actually verbalized it, you thought to yourself, what a dumb idea? Yeah, you ever had that thing? You know, maybe it was at a meeting at your office, and you were sharing ideas, and you thought, I got the answer, and you said the answer, and everybody looked at you like, did you really think this through? And when you thought it through, you thought, no, I didn't think this through, right? Or maybe you're like me, you've worked on some home projects and thought, hey, this is how I'm going to do it. This is a great idea. This is how it's going to work. And then you got in, and I'm not a plumber or electrician, and you discover why you're not a plumber or electrician because you don't know what you're doing. Maybe right now you've been at home, right? You've been sequestering, and you've been trying to figure out how this whole work from home thing, if you are able to work from home, or if you're just sort of hunkering in place. Maybe your kids are home, and you're trying this whole homeschooling thing out, and you're deciding, I'd be glad to pay more for this, right? Because you have this idea how it's just going to go so smooth. We're going to stay on schedule in this time, and it just isn't working. You know, sometimes we have great ideas, and then we mention them. We don't think they're always that great, but sometimes there's still something there. And today we're going to look at a story that John writes about the time in Jesus' life. And actually, John shares something that nobody else shares about that moment, about somebody who had a great idea until they said the idea, and then they recognized, maybe this wasn't so good. But then Jesus took that not so good idea and did something incredible with it. But before we get there, I want to invite you to bow your heads and just pray one more time with me today. Lord, we find ourselves today in lots of places. For some of us, we're by ourselves in our room, by ourselves in our apartment, by ourselves in our house. Some of us are there with a spouse or a significant other. Some of us are surrounded by our kids. Some are surrounded by family and more. But all of us in this moment are in this spot because we need something that we don't have at this moment. We need some hope. We need some direction, something that will say, hey, this won't last, but our question is, how long will it last until it won't last? And we don't have a lot of answers right now. But we do look to you, not necessarily for a specific answer, but just for your assurance and reminder that you are always with us. And that no matter what goes on around us, good, bad, crazy, you have promised that you'll always be there for us. And so today we don't only claim that promise, we hold on to it because it's a thing we need today. And as we have sung, and as we now listen, and as we turn back to this old story, I pray today that you can do something for us to give us a little bit of hope that will get us through another day, another week, another whatever it is until something breaks for us. In your name, amen. Hey, if you've been joining us the last few weeks, we've been asking a specific question. It's simply this: why do you believe what you believe? And I'm guessing for you, just like for me, that question today means something different than it did 3 weeks ago when we started this whole series. Because things have changed. And so now it's not just simply about, I believe this because of something that's happened, or I believe this because of what I've heard, or what somebody's told me, and I believe that person. Now it's like, wow, what do I believe in this time when a lot of the things I believed in aren't there anymore? And to find some answer to that, we've gone back to this guy named John, one of Jesus' disciples. In fact, he was one of the closest of Jesus' disciples. He was one of the inner circle of the 12 that were his closest followers. And John has written this later in life, and he says, listen, I'm writing this now to do something. And he actually writes about 7 signs, 7 miracles that Jesus did. In fact, he will tell us in John chapter 20, he says, listen, there's a lot of miracles I could have written about, but I haven't. I've picked these specific ones. And he says, I picked these specific 7 ones for an important reason. These 7 are written so that you may believe, that is, keep on believing, that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of God. And John says, I know that if you can believe that, you also get something with that. You get this thing called life, not just normal life, but eternal life that even begins today. And John says, I've picked these for a specific reason. I've picked these things, and I'm not writing the stories about Jesus' life and my time with him. I'm not writing them to build a case of what to believe, but I'm writing them to hopefully give you a reason why to believe. So John isn't worried about all the different miracles he could write. He isn't trying to write everything that Jesus ever did. He's writing a story about his memories of his time with Jesus and the things that stuck out as he thinks back on these times. And it's really about that he wants us to believe because we've discovered a reason to believe. And that's why he says, I've written these things. So today we're going to look at another story that John wrote down. This one is the first of the ones we've looked at. This is the 4th one of the signs that John writes about. And it's the first one of those 4 that all the other gospel writers, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these people that wrote about the life of Jesus, all of them write about this particular event. But they all add different details to it. It just reminds us how all of us pick up different things. But John says, listen, I'm writing about this with this in mind. This is one of 7. I've only picked 7, and I want this one to tell you something. And I remember some stuff that everybody else doesn't remember because I was closest to Jesus. I was there, and I heard some things, and I found out some things later that I think will be helpful. Be helpful in your journey to finding a reason to believe. And so here we pick it up over in John chapter 6, verse 1. And John, as he writes this, he says, after this. And the after this is a lot of stuff. After this is that Jesus has just sent out his 12 closest guys. He sent them out in pairs. And they've gone out to share Jesus' teaching, to encourage people to say, hey, maybe just now, this Messiah, this guy that we as Jewish people have dreamed about, maybe we've discovered the one. And so they've come back to Jesus, and they're telling him all these stories, but it's in the midst of a busy, regular ministry day for Jesus. And so Jesus says, hey, let's get a little distance. And another event has happened during this time, and that's that John the Baptist, who was a cousin of Jesus, but also a very important part of Jesus' ministry. He was there at the start and sort of gave Jesus his lunch. He's been killed. He's been executed by a guy named Herod, who's the ruler over this particular region. And he does this thing. You can read about it later. But all the guys are feeling this because some of the guys that are Jesus followers were John's followers, who John said, hey, go follow him. And they now find themselves wrestling with that idea of why did John die? Why did John die this way? And why didn't Jesus do something about this? And so with that and all the stories coming back and their excitement and just the press of all the stuff going on, Jesus says, guys, let's get in a boat and let's go to the other side of this lake that's called the Sea of Galilee. Let's go to the other side. Let's row. We get all our 12 guys in there. Remember, there's at least 13 guys in the boat, and they got all their stuff. Today we'd have backpacks and suitcases, because they're traveling. They're taking everything they have with them. And so this is a huge boat, and they're all rowing. They're rowing across the other side of the sea, and John says they go across the sea, and when they get there, a bunch of people are there. And he says simply that many people followed him. And they followed him for a reason, John says, because they saw the signs, that is the miracles that he had done on behalf of the sick. That word had gotten out about what Jesus would do for people and how he could bring hope into hopeless situations, how he could bring health back into unhealthful situations, how he could bring life back to lives that didn't seem to have much life left in them. And so John says, listen, a bunch of people came and they followed us there, and there's some other stuff going on that we'll discover as John writes. But he says when these people come, Jesus and the guys get the other side, and Jesus went up on a hill, and he sat down there with his followers, and in John's version, and his memories of what took place that day, he doesn't talk about Jesus in doing any teaching, any healing in that moment. And we might think he must not because John says he doesn't, but the other guys will say he does. But for John, that's not the most important thing at this moment. That's not the miracle. That's not the sign that John wants you and I to remember. Jesus goes up on the hill, and John says, oh, by the way, a little back to this story, is that it was almost the time for the Jewish Passover feast. And for those of us who aren't Jewish, it doesn't kind of make a lot of sense. We kind of go, so what? But for them, this was a national event. It was different than how Jews celebrate Passover today. And now they do it in their homes. It's a family thing. Back then, it was a nation thing. It was the one time of the year that you would go to Jerusalem. Everybody would go to Jerusalem. You would see old friends. You'd see people you only saw in Jerusalem this one time of year. It was a time that people gathered, and thousands of people would make that trek. The men would come, the women would come. They'd bring along their kids because this was a time to go remind them that God had brought them out from this oppressive government. And especially in this time that John writes, they're hoping again that God will bring them out of this oppressive government. And so thousands of people have come. And John says that's one of the reasons that we're going to discover there's so many people that show up here. It's not just they come because they've heard of the healing. They've heard that, but they're also already out there on the roads. They're already on their way making their trek. And then John, as he goes on, writes this. As Jesus has gone up on this mountainside, as he sat down with his disciples, as he looks out, and he looks up and sees this large crowd coming towards him. He says something. He says something to Philip. And the reason he says something to Philip may simply be because Philip is from this region, and so he would know the area. He would know what's available, what towns are kind of close to them, what kind of goes on. Because here's the question that he asked Philip. Where can we buy enough bread for all these people to eat? And the crazy thing is, nobody at this moment is planning on feeding anybody. In fact, the other writers, Matthew, Luke, Mark will write that they kind of say, hey, the crowd's too big, we got to send them away. Nobody's planning on feeding them. They want these people to leave. But Jesus says, where can we buy enough bread for everybody? And again, it may be because Philip's from this region. Maybe he knows some places. I mean, there's no big places, but there's maybe some little restaurants that people get food at. Maybe there's some bakeries. He knows where they can kind of get something for these people. Maybe he asked Philip, because maybe Philip is the guy in the group, that every group has this, right? The guy that's just good with numbers, right? You ever been something like that? They're just sort of naturals. You ask him, how much is this? And they just have it off the top of their head. And so Jesus asked him the question, where can we buy enough bread for all these people? As the thousands, we'll find at least 5,000 guys, which means there are thousands more women and children that are coming. As they're coming, Jesus asks, where can we find food for all? Look at them. They keep coming. Where are we going to find food? To which Philip says a response. But before that, John tells us something that he discovered later. Something he remembers as he remembers this story, and whether Jesus told a whole group later or just told John and his brother James and Peter, who were the closest ones. Somewhere John has learned that Jesus had asked Philip this question to test him. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of those moments when somebody asks you a question and you know it's a test, but you didn't know you were having a test today, and you think to yourself, oh no, right? And sometimes when somebody asks you that question, you think, I wonder why they're asking me. There's a reason for asking me this, but I'm not really sure at this moment what that reason is. You know, that is one of the most uncomfortable spots to be in. And Philip's in that spot because Jesus asked this question. John says later, he discovers there's a reason. He's testing him. And the great thing about this, Jesus isn't just testing Philip. John also remembers that Jesus already knew what he planned, what he was going to do. So it wasn't just a test for Philip in the sense of, this is a test, Philip, you got to pass this. This was a test for Philip, but it was also, Jesus already knew what was going to happen, and he also probably already knew how Philip would respond because he's been around Philip. And Philip is this guy that kind of maybe has some numbers, figures these things out. He's the guy you turn to help figure this out. Philip, come back to me with a solution. To which Philip, to the question, where can we get food? He doesn't answer a question of where, he answers a how question. Because Philip answers him and says, listen, someone would have to work almost a year. Someone would have to work for almost a whole year to buy enough food for each person just to have a little piece, just a bite. I mean, for all these thousands, they keep coming, Jesus. It would be like a year's salary, and even that, people are just going to get a bite. He doesn't even answer Jesus' question. He doesn't even give an answer of where. There's a bakery over here. There's a little restaurant over there. There's another kind of a 7-Eleven, but they didn't have 7-Elevens back there, but something like that over there, you know. He just goes to the how. It's impossible, is his point. But then on the scene shows up somebody, another one of the disciples that we hardly ever hear anything about. In fact, this may be the only time that Andrew says anything that is ever recorded in history. And Andrew, we're told, is there. Andrew, who is Simon Peter's brother. And if you're familiar with the Bible story, you know that Peter is is one of those guys that is just always opening his mouth. And I think every person has somebody like this somewhere in their circle, right? You know, they're the person that's the life of the party until they aren't really anymore. You know, they kind of always take it a little too far. It's always, look at me, and then you look at them, and then you're like, I don't want to look at you anymore because you just took it too far. You said too much. And Peter has this history, and we have it recorded for us to remind that Peter is this guy that opens mouth, inserts foot, just always is like that. And Andrew is his brother. And Andrew, I wonder if he hasn't at times been under that kind of pressure of who his brother is. Right? I mean, think about it. If you went to school and you had an older brother or sister, and maybe they were really good students, and the teacher would say, oh, you're Sandra's younger brother. And you're just thinking, oh, I have to live up to all of her A's, right? Or maybe you had the brother that was like Peter, right? Always the class clown, always talking, always the attention, always disrupting things, and the teacher's just going to keep an eye on you because you're Peter's brother. But Andrew's there. And Andrew, who's lived with this pressure of this brother who's always, hey, look at me, let me say something without thinking, oh, this is great. Andrew sees a moment here, and he steps up, and here's what he says to Jesus. Jesus, here's a boy with 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 little fish. He's excited. This idea has popped in his mind. I mean, you can imagine thousands of people are coming, everybody's sitting down, and you know how if you got a big group of people and kids are around, kids always seem to make their way to the front of the group. And they're there, and this little boy's got a little sack lunch, and Andrew's excited because Jesus is looking for food, and he's found some food, and he says to Jesus, look, here's a boy that has 5 loaves of barley and 2 little fish. He's excited, and then as the words come out of his mouth, I think it dawns on him. That wasn't as good as an idea as it sounded up here. Because here's what he says next. Oh, but that's not enough. What are these? For so many people. And I imagine at that moment, Andrew is just embarrassed because here he is, Peter's brother, Peter who always makes these kind of comments, and he's thinking to himself, oh, I just can't get away from his shadow because look at me, I've gone and done the exact same thing that he does that just embarrasses him so much. I said something, and I really thought it was a good idea, but it is a really dumb idea. Because what difference does it make if I have 5 or even if I had 50 loaves of bread? If I had 2 little fish or I had 20 little fish, there's a whole lot of people here. Which takes us back to the question that we've been trying to answer each week. And that's simply this. Why is this the sign that John wants to do? Why does John pick this particular sign? If he's picking 7 signs, why is he picking this one? Because there's a reason, and it goes back to this idea. He wants us to give us something to base belief on. And here's the thing I want you to think about for a moment. One person's faith can make the difference. I mean, think about it. Here we got Andrew, who's got this great idea. At least it sounds so great to him. And when he mentioned it, he's like, oh, this is a really dumb idea. But in that moment, he has expressed some faith. He's actually done something that Philip didn't do. Philip was like, this is too much. We don't have enough. And even Andrew, after he says it, recognizes we don't have enough, but at least he had something to start with. And what if the reason that John writes this one as one of the particular signs he wants you and I to know is a reminder that your faith, that one person's faith, can make the difference, even when it seems like it's not even a great solution to the problem. Back to the story. Because the reality is you've got to start with something. Jesus says, all right, guys, tell the people to sit down, which is kind of funny because if you've ever met a lot of people, you don't want them sitting down. The only reason you want them to sit down is they're excuse them by tables, right? This group now, number 85, number 353, because there's a lot of people, right? You want them in lines because that's how you feed people quick. But Jesus says, no, have everybody sit down. And this is a part of the story that I think you have to recognize. The only people that know what's going on is Jesus and the 12 disciples, maybe this little boy who's up there, and just a few people in the front rows, right? Because there's thousands of people, and they're noisy, they're talking, they're sitting down, they're trying to figure out what's going on. But the only people that get an insight to all the stuff that's going on is this small group of people. And Jesus says, tell them to sit down. And John says, it was actually a good place to sit down because there was plenty of grass there. And so he says, about 5,000 men sat down. There's this big group of men, and I don't know how they necessarily counted them, but maybe it's a ballpark, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't actually 5,000 exactly. It's sort of a rough, there was a lot, this is it, but it means there's a lot more. Some have suggested that maybe up to 20,000 if everybody was, a wife and 2 children, or some were single, but some had 3 or 4 children. It was a whole mess of people sitting on this hillside. And you have to imagine they are crowded in there. They're just piled in there. They're told to sit down. Jesus is maybe going to do something. They're sitting there. They don't really know because they're too far away to hear what's going on. But they all sit down. And then Jesus, John remembers him taking the loaves of bread, and he thanks God. He gives thanks for them. And I kind of want you just to think about that moment, because you're probably familiar with the story and you already know how it all ends. But just for a moment, I want you to take yourself and put yourself back in there. Imagine what it must have been like, kind of looking at Jesus. Andrew's made this thing. Great idea, really dumb idea, Andrew. All of a sudden, Jesus picks it up. He takes this 5 little pieces of bread, these little loaves, these little cheap things that you have that just kind of get you through the day, and these little 2 pieces of probably salted fish, because that would help on the trip, just kind of dried. And Jesus stops, and he gives thanks. And I don't know whether you bow your head at your meals, whether you close your eyes. I'm wondering if when Jesus does this, even if he closes his eyes, if everybody else doesn't close their eyes, because I want to see what he's going to do with 5 little pieces of bread and 2 fish, right? But he gives thanks. He says, and John remembers him, that Jesus gave, that he distributed them to the people who were sitting there. And he doesn't go into detail how this all works, whether Jesus is handing a piece of bread and it just is this huge line that keeps going out farther. If at some point people, like oftentimes happens in big crowds, people see a chance to serve, chance to help out, and so they come up and they're taking, food, get to the back quicker and moving around. But Jesus begins to distribute all this. He gets the bread out, and John says he also did the same thing with the fish. And the crazy thing was, he says, he gave people as much bread and fish as they wanted. And so this is not insane. This goes on for a while. This has to go on for maybe hours as you feed. Let's just use 15,000 just to have a safe number. Especially when they're not in line, especially when they're just spread out and you're having to get to all the back and getting the food from here all the way back there. And then John remembers that when they had all had enough to eat, that they were all filled, Jesus says something to his disciples. And what he says to them is simply this: gather the leftover pieces of fish and bread so that nothing is wasted. Because you'd imagine there's got to be, if you've eaten your fill, at some point you're like, one more bite of bread, it's enough, I'm just dropping it, right? Or I got too much, I asked for more, but now I have way too much. And Jesus, but in this moment, it's a reminder to his disciples, and we'll discover it becomes a thing for the crowd as well, that this is a Jewish crowd. And they're reminded that somebody else that was a significant leader of theirs, somebody they looked to as sort of a Messiah figure, somebody who would bring them out, free them from oppression, a guy by the name of Moses, had done something very similar. Except it was every day they got food. They got the food what they needed for every day for years while they were out traveling. This food from heaven, the manna it was called. And on Friday, they'd get double the portion. That was the only day they got more than they needed. The rest of the day, they got just enough to need it. But here, Jesus gives them more than they need. So much more that they have some leftovers. And Jesus doesn't want it wasted. And we don't have any explanation by any of the guys that were there to tell us what he meant by not being wasted. Was it so that they could have food as they walked on their trip that they gave to people? Were they giving some people some to-go bags as they went there? We don't have the explanation. But here's what happened. He says, so they, talking about the disciples, gathered up the pieces, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces left from the 5 barley loaf breads. What I love about this is they don't mention they have got any fish at the end, which may tell us something about people. Fish would have been more expensive than bread. Fish would have been a thing they didn't have as much of, and fish would have traveled better. Bread, after a couple of days, may have gotten really stale. That kind of fish would last for a long time. It would get them to Jerusalem and maybe get them back home. And so everybody maybe was pocketing that. Maybe I just need a little bit more, but it's kind of funny. He says, pick up the fish and the loaves, and all they get is 12 baskets of fish. And then John, as he reflects back, remembers this thing that happens And then how Jesus responds to it. He says, when the people saw this sign, this miracle, this feeding of the 5,000 men and however many other people there are, that reminds them of Moses, reminds them of deliverance, reminds them of maybe there is still hope for us, they said, he must truly be the prophet who is coming into this world. It triggered something in their minds and even in their hearts that here is that guy that we've been thinking about and hoping about and praying for generations. Somebody that will save us, somebody that will get us out of this. And we've heard about this prophet come, and this must truly be this guy. And John hears the people begin to talk this way because they've been sitting there for hours now, and they know they've gotten food and they haven't seen the food trucks drive up, right? There hasn't been any deliveries showing up. They just know that all of a sudden everybody gets food and nobody saw that much food any place because that would have been a lot of food and you would have seen it. And then John says that Jesus knew, which he always seems to know, that Jesus knew that the people intended that what they were about to come and to take him by force and make him king. And when it sounds like force, it sounds like, they're going to grab him and you're going to have to be king. It's a simple idea that they are a crowd that is worked up. They're a crowd that's going for Passover, this reminder, this yearly reminder that God delivers, God delivers, God delivered us, and we want him to deliver us again today. And now, maybe just now, we got the guy to deliver us. And we're going to go. We got 5,000 men. As we go along the way, we're going to get more. When we get to Jerusalem, we might be up. We might double our numbers. We might triple our numbers as stories get out, as we talk. We might be ready to get to Jerusalem and make him king because we'll be too many for the Romans to push back. And Jesus, John says, knew that they were thinking this way because they wanted this king. They wanted freedom so bad. And then John tells us Jesus did something unexpected. So he left and he went into the hills alone. And if you're going to read the other accounts, you'll hear other stories about actually Jesus tells the guys to get in the boat, that he sends the people away, that Jesus diffuses the crowd. And I don't know how he does it. This crowd that's that worked up to force him to take him to kind of say, you're our guy and we're going to take you and we're going to go. He brings it all down. And for the disciples, I think Jesus sends the disciples away simply because he doesn't want that added pressure for them because they have the exact same hope. They think he's going to be the king. And if I'm close to the king now, I'll be in a really sweet spot later. And so Jesus says, you guys got to go. And they got to go, and I just need some space. And here's the question I'm going to ask as we wrap this all up today. Why would Jesus feed them knowing how they react? Because clearly Jesus knew what he was going to do, and he knew how the people would respond because he was a smart enough guy. I mean, he didn't even have to have special insight. He just knew that where the climate was at, where the hopes were at, where the longings were at for people. So why would Jesus feed them knowing that it would just feed this other stuff that would get all stirred up? And I think there's a very simple, plain answer, and it's this. That Jesus doesn't do what we think he should. He does what he needs to do, which is always a hard thing for us. Because here's something I think that is true for all of us. When our hopes create a picture, it is hard to erase that picture. And hasn't that been true in your life? You've got this picture of how it's going to go, how life's going to go, how work's going to go, how a relationship's going to go, how kids are going to go, how all these things are going to go. And you get this picture and then it doesn't work out and we get so frustrated and so pressed because it's not working out that way. And it's a reminder, an important reminder for all of us who find ourselves in a place we didn't expect today to be 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 months ago. And it's going to be the same in a few weeks when we're not at the place we thought we were going to be even today. And it's an important reminder that as much as Jesus loves us and cares for us and wants the best for us, his version of that, his picture of that and how that all works out isn't always the same as our picture of that. See, what if the reason to believe is not because you get something, but because Jesus is something. See, that group of people had been there because they were hoping Jesus was going to do some more miracles. He was going to do some more stuff, and he does. He feeds them. He doesn't do all the healing stuff that maybe they heard about, but he does some feeding there. And then you'll find out later, if you keep reading the story, that Jesus will kind of tell them later, listen, you guys are just all following me because you want something. It was kind of like those moments that if probably you remember when you were a kid, if you had a parent that traveled much, or if you have your own kids, that if you've traveled much and you come home, and one of the first things your kids say to you is this classic line, right? Oh, Daddy, it's so good to have you home. What did you bring me, right? And if you have that great line, I brought you me, they go, oh. And for some of us, we're in one of those oh moments. But what if what we have been brought is better than what we wished we'd been brought? See, it's easy to see what we don't have and miss what we do have. And that's true for all of us. When Jesus takes those little bread and gives thanks, he knows that he's giving thanks because something is going to happen. We give thanks because maybe we have some food today. Or maybe in this process of this stuff, we're beginning to give thanks because we have food today, when before it was just, hey, thank you for this food. We forgot it. In fact, in a Jewish cultures and Jewish systems, they actually their thankfulness actually goes when they have a piece of bread. It's not just thank you for some bread, but it's thank you for the person who baked it, for the person who put it all together, for the person that grew it. And thank you, God, for watering. Maybe for us, it can be a moment like that in this time, that we begin to thank God for more instead of thanking him for less. Can we be thankful for what seems not enough? Because Andrew had this great idea, a lot of faith, and then even that's not enough, and he thinks it's a dumb idea. But what if your idea, what if your faith, what if your hope and trust isn't that dumb of an idea? What if your not enough is actually enough? Because if it is enough, can you trust Jesus? Trust Jesus to make that not enough enough.